Alrighty, so as of a couple of weeks ago, we knew that Blizzard was going to be announcing some level 7 affix row revamps, retuning, changes. It kind of seemed like they may be toying with a rework of the level 7 row, but today we got some information of what is going to be active on the 10.1 PTR as of Mythic Plus testing this week, and how some of these affixes are going to be changing, potentially be removed, and that kind of thing. So first and foremost, let's talk about what is happening. So 3 affixes of the level 7 row have been retired, and those 3 are Quaking, Grievous, and Volcanic. They are no longer going to be in the game. In addition to that, there are 3 new affixes, and let's talk about what they are. And at the end of this, I'm going to kind of give my thoughts on it and just kind of talk about what generally what I think. Obviously, this is before any testing is available, so it's subject to change, but this is just going to generally be my thoughts. So first off, we have Afflicted. And it's while in combat, afflicted souls appear that seek the aid of players. Afflicted souls spawn with poison, curse, and disease afflictions, and removing any of these afflictions or healing the spirit to full health causes it to despawn. Failure to remove these afflictions will inflict players with a negative status effect, and it's unclear specifically what the negative status effect is going to be. But it sounds like failure to do so within 10 seconds does 0 damage, but it reduces the haste of all players by 100%. So it doesn't sound like it's a damaging affliction whenever it doesn't get removed, but instead you get your haste reduced by 100%, which is not good. It's particularly a punishing affix. In addition to this, we have Entangling, and so this reads, while in combat, Entangling binds snare players. And then there's a couple of spells that are attached to this, and I think that actually reading the Wowhead blurb on this, Entangling looks straightforward and not how the tooltip of the affix reads at all. Players will get attached to a vine, kind of similar to some of the world quests we had back in Zereth Mortis, and then that slows them by 50% and forces them to run away from one anchor point within 8 seconds to snap the vine. Obviously similar to those quests that players either loved or hate. Otherwise, they'll get stunned for 3 seconds. Highly mobile classes will find this affix pretty trivial. However, 50% slow can easily cause death on trash or a boss, so this affix seems very, very punishing at the moment. Obviously, this is a bit more narrative. But I actually think this is kind of interesting. Kind of depends on how it works. There's a question certainly about whether or not the snare can be freedomed off with things such as, obviously, Paladin Freedom, Tiger's Lust. Can you shapeshift it off? Can you hunter disengage it off? Can you fade the snare off? That kind of thing. Or are you going to be forced to run 10 yards away? Obviously, that's going to be determined at a later date, but we will see how that works out. And then the final affix that we have is Incorporeal. And that states, while in combat, incorporeal beings appear and attempt to destabilize players with spells that reduce their damage and healing done. Incorporeal beings are susceptible to all forms of crowd control. And this is actually a really weird one. So incorporeal beings seem like it's an extra ad that needs to be controlled whenever it pops up, and it has a 20-second buff duration according to spell data, and it cannot be reasonably killed. This forces players to just deal with it for 20 seconds, and it also has the destabilizing spell, which is an 8-second cast that must be stopped, or else it applies a 50% damage and healing down for 10 seconds. Now, this one's really interesting, and I think that it's going to be very predicated off of like the dungeons. It seems like, how is it going to spawn? Is it going to summon itself? You know, kind of similar to Thundering, once every minute of you're in combat, that kind of thing, or is it going to be summoned just as you go on in the dungeon? In addition to that, the only other massively notable thing about affixes that are going to be changed is an update to explosives, where fewer explosive orbs spawn, but now they have substantially higher HP. And now this is a question of like how high is the HP and how few orbs spawn. Now, all of these things and all of my opinions are going to be given prior to having tested the affixes. And I want to make this explicitly clear that things may change based off of how lenient Blizzard is with the affixes themselves, or how difficult these affixes actually turn out to be. Of course, reacting before you actually see the affix can be dangerous in some aspects, because you're not going to be able to give accurate feedback as to how you think about the affix. But I think that let's just kind of talk about affixes as a whole. I'm worried that Blizzard is still moving in the wrong direction. So, and what do I mean by that? It's So they removed Grievous, Quaking, and Volcanic, which, you know, Quaking was a significantly problematic affix just on the whole. Grievous and Volcanic had a decent amount of outplay potential, but Quaking was the one that interacted with dungeons in a significantly negative manner. In addition to that, affixes that, especially on this level 7 road, that have interacted with the dungeons in a negative manner, such as Quaking, such as Explosive, and honestly Storming, are the ones that are seen as historically more negative. They're less fun to play. They're a lot more, I would just say, annoying. And now I worry that things like this are continuing the trend of you're playing the affixes more than you're playing the dungeon. And so I created a video a couple weeks back, and one of the biggest things that I talked about is that you're playing the affixes more than you're playing the dungeon. And I don't and whenever I heard that they were doing a revamp of the level 7 row, I was hoping that they were going to be doing something that got you to a state where you were playing the dungeon more than you were playing the affixes. Now with how the Afflicted, Entangling, and Incorporeal affixes sound, plus the change to Explosive, I'm a bit worried that they're not going in the direction I was kind of hoping. And so what I mean by that is, so for Afflicted, for example, whenever there are mechanics that overlap with Afflicted, and honestly, like if Afflicted is active with something such as, you know, bursting, and your healer has to make a decision as to whether or not they're going to dispel the afflicted soul, or whether or not they're supposed to dispel the tank from bursting and then heal that up, is that really a good decision? In addition to that, there are actually a decent amount of like mandatory dispels for players in dungeons, and this again starts the trend of, are we playing the dungeon or are we playing the affix? And so then you have things such as, I guess a good one is the Thundercallers in Halls of Valor. The Thundercallers put a circle on you, and after a couple seconds it expires, and the expectation is that you dispel off the debuff, right? That dot that's attached to your player. The expectation is that you dispel that off. Kind of similar to like Temple of the Jade Serpent last boss. And are we going to end up in a situation where Blizzard has to be very careful with what kind of things they add to the dungeon? Because not all classes have the ability to be able to dispel, right? Like say if you play with a group that has hybrid dispels in your group. Say you play comp that's actually kind of meta this season, such as Moonkin's Priest, Prot Paladin, and then, you know, either one of Preservation Evoker or Restoration Shaman. You actually have a lot of like dispel coverage for this kind of thing, and in addition to that, you obviously have the ability to be able to heal it up. Now, say you play with something such as Prot Warrior, Havoc Demon Hunter, Rogue, you know, that kind of thing, and then I don't even know what your fifth would be, you know, another Rogue or something like that. And you don't have dispel coverage Hunter, something like that just doesn't have dispel coverage, then the Otis is 100%, the burden is 100% on your healer to be able to get rid of this, and that in my mind becomes problematic. Yeah, now obviously this could be just a lot easier. In addition to that, we don't really know how often we get it. I think that the downside, failure to do this within 10 seconds does 0 damage, but it reduces the haste of all players to 100 by 100%. I think that this is actually a very smart design from Blizzard's perspective, and I think that things like this and the damage down from Incorporeal, overall, I think that these are pretty smart decisions, but they are very, very punishing if you mess them up, as opposed to in the past where if you messed up Explosive, you would die, that kind of thing. Or if you messed up Volcanic, you got hit by a volcano, you would get knocked up in the air and take a little bit of damage. Same with Grievous. Yeah, so they're moving away from things that do damage to you, at least in some capacity, and moving into things that do damage downs. Now, Entangling, I think that this one was like originally displayed as something that it's not necessarily. And so a Snare is something that most classes in the game have the ability to get out of easily, right? With abilities that I cited earlier, depending on whether or not the Snare can be freedomed off, or shapeshifted, or faded, or whatever, right? Whether or not the Snare can be removed, that's actually a pretty big deal. I'm interested in, like, are all players going to get attached to a vine? I think that this is a bit more reasonable of an affix than some people are making it sound like on Twitter. But I think that this is something that, like, in my mind, this is kind of why they removed Quaking, right? Quaking was a weird one where a lot of the time on bosses, just look at Bonemon Wise Mari, for example, you don't have the opportunity to be able to, move 10 yards away. So you have to stay stacked for some mechanics specifically, or staying stacked is just really advantageous in the dungeon. And whether or not you get this entangling at a specific time, whether or not you get it on specific players can be a big deal. And I think that things like this that interact and impact your movement as heavily, such as what Quaking did in the past, is immediately a red flag for me. Additionally, I'm really worried about this going on my tank. I think that that's the thing that I'm a bit most concerned about, because tanks have even lower ability to be able to just move 10 yards kind of on demand, or moving 10 yards might actually just be very bad for the group. And I think that things such as entangling, obviously it's not super clear how it's going to work yet. Can it be dispelled? Is it just a snare? Is it what it really is, the situation of this entangled? And so it's something that we're going to have to play. But immediately this one also kind of throws a little bit of red flags as to, if you look at it from a pessimistic POV, how can this be unfun? But I think overall, the fun part of this, I do worry that they've lost the fun aspect of entangling. And honestly, I think all these affixes, they've kind of lost the fun affix, or the fun part of these affixes. Incorporeal, I think, is probably the most annoying one. So with this season, we use a lot of CC chains for things. And the dungeons that I'm thinking of right off the bat are Azure Vault and Algathar Academy. Those dungeons have heavily promoted CC chaining packs of mobs. So the Lashers in Azure Vault and the manifestations, the Blueberry dudes in Algathar Academy, just utilizing full CC chains and rotating CC or stops for, upwards of 20 seconds in some points has been a pretty big thing this season. And I'm concerned about an ad that you're going to have to throw stops into, kind of disrupting that. And this is obviously from a high player perspective, a high-end perspective. For low-end players, you're not throwing stops into the manifestations anyways. You're just pulling those packs one pack at a time because you don't really care about the timer. But for a high-end perspective, I don't know. This actually does seem particularly annoying, especially depending on how far away the mob spawns. It seems like an extra ad. Does that just pop up in the middle of the pack? Can you there's a lot of questions as to how this mob is going to work. And I think that this is the one that has the highest amount of upside once we see it. But this is also the one that, if it's done poorly, it can be just as bad, honestly, as something like Inspiring or Emissary of the Tides, where it's it just makes the dungeon so much less fun, and it makes pulls less accessible. Because even Inspiring, Blizzard did a really good job of identifying specific mobs or specific packs that Inspiring would be well placed in, and then they typically put the caster mob as the inspired mob. But the biggest deal with Mythic Plus, in my opinion, is the ability to route in a way that is unique for your composition and unique in the sense of you have good strategy in the dungeon. And Incorporeal removes that aspect in some ways. Obviously, we don't know for certain how it's going to function, but at least it reads like it will disrupt that flow and change the route of the dungeon, which is something that I don't believe a level 7 affix should generally be looking to do. I think that affixes in general shouldn't completely make routes inaccessible because you're worried about getting an incorporeal spawn on a pull that you otherwise deem possible, right? Some groups in front of Veximus will triple pull all of those manifestations and use a great and well-executed CC chain to be able to keep those mobs dealt with. Now, with Incorporeal, some weeks you're able to do that, and some weeks you aren't. And I just don't, depending on how this works, I don't feel like that's the correct play. Now, it could be significantly easier. I could see a world where this comes out and it is way easier, and you get one that spawns every 3 minutes. But I think that with the pessimist version of me views it as thundering, right? Where we get one permitted in combat and we just have to deal with it. Now, fortunately enough, the downside is that it's not an instant wipe. It's a 50% damage and healing down. But in I don't want to say all instances because that would be just a lie, but in a lot of instances, a 50% damage and healing down is going to wipe you because the pack is going to last significantly longer. Now, it's not always going to be that way, but You know what I'm saying? For explosive, I think that explosive, like I said earlier, there's a question of how few and how much HP. Now, the issue with explosive has and always will be the problem of that very few classes could deal with explosive effectively. And we saw this whenever explosives had more HP back in BFA. This was the last time that we played it, a higher HP variation of explosives. And there were very few classes that were able to deal with them. Some of those were Outlaw Rogue is the one that comes to mind immediately, and Havoc Demon Hunter is the other one that comes to mind immediately as the classes that were realistically able to do with them. Holy Paladin, I think, was the other one that was pretty good with like Judgment, or like Holy Paladin / Ret Paladin with like Judgment was decent at dealing with them, but not great. Now, there is a question of like how high HP are they going to have? Are they willing to actually change the cast time on them as well? Now, it's a problem whenever the explosive cast time is so short because you want to throw instant cast abilities at them, especially if you're like a caster, because hard casting into the explosive isn't realistically a thing that you can do with a lot of travel time abilities and as a decent amount of builders. So say you're like an elemental shaman or something like that. Are you really going to lightning bolt the explosive? That seems super bad. On top of that, cleave off of the explosive orbs typically doesn't work super well. I'm a bit concerned about how this is going to function, but there is a genuine question of like how few explosives are you getting? Like on 10 mobs, are you getting one explosive orb every, 10 or 15 seconds? Because if it's like that and you actually say on 10 mobs you get one explosive orb every 15 seconds, that seems a little bit more reasonable. I hope that they would be willing to at least increase the cast time on the explosive orb as well, just to try to allow some better counterplay specifically from casters, because things such as BM Hunter with kill command, target swapping instantly, that kind of thing is going to be pretty good here. Same with classes that don't really lose a lot for target swapping. I think Outlaw Rogue is still particularly good at that kind of thing. Havoc Demon Hunter does all of their cleave and they'll just end up like throwing chaos strikes into explosives. The classes that were previously good at it are probably still going to be good at it. Now some other classes that have to like hard cast a bunch of abilities, I'm thinking things like Shadow Priest and like Moonkin and that kind of thing, are going to be typically fare worse off, or like Arcane Mage. Like I don't even know how they're supposed to hit an explosive orb, that kind of thing. Now I do understand that the feedback that they got from explosives is that it was too much of a healer affix, and so Blizzard is looking at this and they're like, I want to change this to be more of a group effort, and I think that is a noble cause, and I think that is something that I understand why they're attempting to try to change it, but at the same point, they need to really be thinking about how to make it actually a group effort, as opposed to, now this has the problem where only a couple classes can realistically hit them. Like again, it's just gonna be a problem potentially of target swapping. Now, again, I want to make this explicitly clear. All of my thoughts are before we've tested the affixes. I know I'll come off a bit pessimistic here. A lot of people were way more down in the dumps than I was. I'm not like that mad about it. I really need to see a decent amount of these affixes before I genuinely am willing to give like a super strong opinion. So make sure you subscribe and stay tuned for whenever the testing comes out for that kind of thing, because I'm going to be looking at some of the testing. I'm going to be making a new video talking about like what we have actually seen from the testing and what that really means. And so if you like that kind of content, make sure you like and subscribe. But yeah, I think that's going to be it for the video today. I hope you guys all enjoyed, and I will see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.